Be me, be Brazilian. Just finished school, and after studying a lot and through some miracle of luck, managed to get into a good public university in my state. Although not in the course I wanted. Be sad because I wanted to study something else, but it is what it is. In uni, most people are retarded normies who only think about the usual things. Normies think these days Instagram, Twitter, the latest American issue imported to the Brazilian political debate, pronouns, be at the uni library one day, looking at the books they have on the history and sociology section. Lots of books about religion and occultism here, covering everything from African folk religion to ancient mystery cults. This piques my interest, and I begin to spend my time reading these instead of the course S subjects. This goes on for weeks. During this time, a guy came up and began talking to me. He introduced himself as N, cool dude, albeit a little strange, had this slumped eye, which was really noteworthy on his face, and walked as if he was always slightly off balance. He also had a string on his neck that seemed to hold some kind of necklace, although I never saw what the necklace was exactly. He and I shared the interest about occultism, although he was clearly way more knowledgeable in the matter than me. In all conversations we had, he led the subject, and I always came out of them knowing things I would never imagine or probably even find in the library books. He tells me the library is cool and has lots of resources, but some things are simply not available in places like this and that. To know the real truths, I needed to go beyond that. I asked him what he meant by this, and he said that if I wanted, he could show me some special books he had that showed the truth of things. I asked if he was talking about things like the Lesser Key of Solomon or dogmas and rituals of high magic. Some books I already knew from the occultist phenomena, or even the book of Saint Cyprian, a very popular grimoire here in Brazil, said to have mainly metamorphosis powers. But he said those books were nothing compared to the things he had read curious. I agreed to his proposal, and he invited me to go to his home that weekend. When I arrived there on Saturday afternoon, it was a normal middle-class house on a small and unremarkable neighborhood. He welcomed me inside and explained that his mother was asleep, so we should not make much noise. The house was pretty silent and somewhat cold and dark, even though the day outside was very sunny. Most windows were shut, and this gave the house a very still feeling. He took me to his room, which was on the back of the house. When we entered, I saw that it was also very dark, with only a small sliver of light entering from a crack in the curtains. It was a pretty unremarkable room, quite small, painted white, and with the standard furniture you would expect. What really caught my attention was the 3 bookshelves spread through the walls filled with books. When I say filled, I do mean filled to the brim with the things, to the point that some books were in front of others and piled up in a disorderly manner to make up space for the things. He smiled at my astonishment and began talking about how his grandfather was a collector of books and how the custom must have rubbed off on him, although not on his own father. He told me that when his grandpa died, he left a chest with lots of special old books to him. Apparently, he was also big on the occult, and had some materials from the imperial times that once belonged to the church, and detailed many obscure occult practices. I asked to see one of them, and he went to the foot of his bed, where a large wooden chest with a sturdy-looking lock rested. He pulled up the string from his neck, and I saw that the necklace was just a key, a very old-looking iron key made to look like a cross. When he opens the chest, I can see a lot of leather-bound books without any covers, just different shades of brown, black, and red. There's not even titles on the covers. And the material seems very old, like just by looking at them, I get scared that they might turn to sand or something. He carefully picks one of the books and lays it gently atop his computer table. The tome is heavy and thick, and when he opens it, I can see the yellowed pages. The first page of the book has a religious picture, and something written in Latin. He explains to me that it is the Creed prayer. Apparently the priests who wrote these books made them like this to prevent them falling into wrong hands or something. Luckily, the rest of the book is in Latin, but in old-school Portuguese, which, although somewhat difficult to read, isn't impossible to someone who isn't monkey-brained. The book seems to be a study of some finer points of Goetia, containing lists of demons, astrological tables for summoning hours, procedures for rituals, and the like. It's a very complete and complex volume, apparently, with hundreds of pages going into the specifics of how to summon demons, elementals, and spirits. and making sure they don't fuck you up. He explains to me that while this book has the how to one needs to summon demons, the real jewel is the more theoretical works that explain the worldview you need to have to first be able to make the rituals at all, and then not be consumed by the creatures. I listened to his lecture with great interest, although admittedly I always had a rough time with these right state of mind ideas. Always seemed like religious crap to me, and since I left the church early, my cynicism was very strong in regards to these things. My interest is mainly in the fact that these books seem the real legit deal, and so if there is something capable of summoning the supernatural, that should be it. I asked them if we could summon something with those books. Since he had them for so long, he probably knew how to use them, right? He tells me that he received them just last year, and that he didn't believe himself ready to do a summoning yet. His state of mind wasn't prepared for it. He wasn't pure enough, etc. I insist with him over and over, trying to convince him that we should do it. I even ask once if he had already seen or summoned something at all to know if they work. He says he tried once, but it didn't work out that well, which is why he is dedicating himself to the theoretical studies more before doing anything else. Maybe I should have asked what went wrong, but I was so interested in testing the supernatural that I didn't bother, instead going back to pestering him about trying some rituals. The rest of the afternoon was divided between we talking about occultism and me trying to get him to do a ritual. He didn't budge the entire time, but I wasn't going to let this opportunity slide without a fight. So when we said our goodbyes by the end of the day, I promised myself I wouldn't stop until I had convinced him to try a ritual. During the next weeks, I insist progressively more on him to try something up. He tries to hook me into his theoretical study ideas, saying that if I summoned something without the proper preparation, something bad would happen. But I insist that if we followed just the grimoires, everything would be fine. This goes on for almost a month until, finally, he gives in, telling me that I had won and that he believed he could pull the weight of us both in a ritual with his knowledge, but that I would have to do everything he said. I agreed, and we decide to try summoning an air elemental in his backyard. He says he wanted to summon any demons because that is asking for trouble. He also asked me to purify myself for a month before we did the summoning, trying to eat less meat, avoid pornography, ire, and other sins, as this could fuck up the ritual. Can I say I did much effort on that department? We wait for a day when his parents wanted to be home for the night. It's a July night, his parents are away at a party, and we can begin our work. I want to explain the ritual with details to you guys, because I don't think the average X-File has the sense to practice this without getting fucked. But what I can say is that we spent a good time making circles and sigils on the dirt of his backyard, as well as arranging candles and some other ritualistic tools. Before the ritual began, he asked me to join him in a prayer for protection and purification. He had already asked me to bathe profusely before coming to his house tonight, and frankly, I was getting tired of all this purification shit. But I followed with his orders because I had promised to. Once everything was set up, we began the summoning ritual. Now, most people believe that you have to sacrifice living creatures to get a supernatural being to come to you. That isn't always the case. You can also make the offer of food and drink, and some spirits accept that. Only more demanding creatures will require a living sacrifice to manifest themselves. So we did that. We got some meat, fruits, and wine together and offered it to the elemental. I was mainly repeating what my friend said as he had more experience, but I had difficulty pronouncing the Latin incantations used to bring the creature forth. We chanted for a long while. It seemed like an entire hour, and the cold wind of the night only made it worse. It was a dark night, and there seemed to be no stars above. Even the neighborhood seemed more silent than normal. It seemed that we are wholly alone. It was then that I heard and felt a strong gust of wind, completely out of nowhere. It was as if some giant had begun blowing upon us with terrible strength. My clothes began to be pulled violently. The pages of the grimoire on NS hand began to flap wildly, interrupting him mid-chant, and some clothes that were hung on the backyard flew off. I almost fell because of the surprise and force of the wind, but I did my best to stay up. N had told me not to leave the circle under any circumstances. I tried asking him what was happening, but I found myself unable to beat the gust of wind that now dominated the backyard. I gazed upon him, and he seemed to be still chanting the ritual from memory, as he could no longer read from the book which was now being violated by the terrible wind. It was a terrible and terrifying situation. I felt my legs and whole body shake, not from the cold of the night wind, but from the fear that we had messed with something beyond us and found what we searched for. I don't know for how long the violent gust lasted, but it felt like hours. Terrible, long and cold hours. Then it died down. The violent gust slowly became more like a breeze, a tremendously good breeze, yes, but still a breeze. No more that violent tornado-like gust of hell. I could now hear my friend chanting again. But his voice was also dying down. I looked at him and saw that he had stopped chanting. I asked him what had happened, but he just raised his hand and shooed me, closing his eyes and raising his head as if trying to hear something. I got confused for a second, until I began to hear very faint whispers coming from all around us, as if we were suddenly in the midst of a whispering crowd. I looked around, but there was nothing to see except the clothes on the strings that were still faintly moving, giving the illusion that something was there. The whispers continued, and I couldn't make sense of them. They seemed to be asking something, but I couldn't even make out what kind of language they were. They just sounded vaguely cohesive, like when you are drifting off to sleep and you hear people on your house, but you can understand what they are talking about. I felt once again a terrible cold and a sensation of my legs shaking, but this was now an internal cold, the kind of thing you feel when you think you fucked up real bad. I don't know if this was because of the whispers, but I felt like something or some things were looking at us, as if we had summoned a whole gaggle of undead spirits that would now haunt us forever. It felt like forever, but eventually my friend began speaking, but it felt as if he wasn't talking to me. I had difficulty making up what he was saying because the wind seemed to be stronger around him, as if he was becoming the eye of the storm. This went on for a while, until finally, after I had shat enough bricks, the wind seemed to die down again, and he opened his eyes. The feeling of being observed went away with it. He told me to chant with him a finishing prayer to make sure the elemental went away, and I concurred, although I stuttered somewhat while saying the Latin words. Afterwards, we quickly disassembled the ritual preparations, and I noticed that the wine had vanished from the bottle, which was now empty. We went into his house and turned all the lights on. We both were visibly shaken from the experience, and I asked him what had happened during the ritual. He explained that we had managed to summon some wind elemental, but that it was too violent and powerful to be the one specified in the ritual. He said the elemental didn't answer to the name in the book, and thus he had to use a different closing incantation to get rid of it, as he didn't know the name of what he was talking to. I felt as if a cube of ice had materialized in my stomach. I asked him if the creature had gone away for sure, to which he looked at me with a not very trusty face and said, "Maybe you never know for sure with these things." After that, we parted ways. I called an Uber to go back home since I didn't want to get mugged. He had offered me to stay at his home, but after the experience, I decided I didn't want to go back there for a while. I managed to fall asleep pretty quickly. I didn't notice how much tired I was until I laid down. But I didn't sleep well that night. I can remember exactly why, but I feel like I had terrible dreams during that whole night. When I woke up the next day, I still felt weirded out by all that had happened. I didn't have enough time to process the happening last night because I was just so tired when I got home. But now that I was awake again, I began to think just how crazy the entire thing was, where a normal person would have their curiosity satisfied or be fearful that something bad may happen. The event only made my desire to know more grow, and I quickly picked up my phone and texted N to talk about yesterday. The conversation dragged on. He was taking his sweet time to answer my texts. I felt at the time that he probably was tired after the whole ordeal the previous night. I for sure was. He seemed as impressed as me that it actually had worked, and neither of us had died. So I convinced him that we should try with a demon next time. He said that he would think about it, and recommended me again that I should read theory to better my abilities. I told him I would next time I went to his home, without any intention of actually doing it. The next weeks I spent a lot of time going to his home, not to study theory, but instead to learn more about the rituals to invoke demons, which were way more complicated. We decided that, if we were going to summon a demon, we might as well try to summon one that would help us with our grades in college, since we had been skipping a lot of classes to study the occult, and it was beginning to take a toll on our grades. After going through many names in his books, we decided to summon Glacia Labolas, who, amongst other things, is capable of teaching the arts and sciences. We waited again for the adequate astrological moment, and he stressed again that I should purify myself, this time especially because we were going to deal with a demon and thus purity and strength where necessary. I was very tired those days, and I believed it was because of having to juggle between college and the occult. So I started going less and less to college and spending more time sleeping or studying the rituals with him. I even convinced him to allow me to copy some pages of the book and take it back home with me for further study. The day finally came and we were ready. It was another night, but this time he insisted we shouldn't do it near his house. So we gave our parents the excuse of going to a party, and instead gathered our things and went to an abandoned terrain in the farther part of the neighborhood. To prevent someone recognizing us, we wore coats with hoods to hide our faces. It was still a very scary situation, since it was late at night and the two of us could be mugged. We hoped that the appearance of Satanists we surely gave off would scare away any criminals. When we get there, we quickly begin to prepare the terrain for the summoning again. This time it's a lot more work, and the air is just as cold as the time we summoned the elemental. The terrain is very dark. The only light source is from an old lamppost on the street, its yellow light shining meekly upon the dirt and grass of the abandoned terrain. Once everything is ready, we get inside the circle and begin to chant the invocation in Latin. I fared way better this time, having trained extensively for it, but I was still somewhat afraid N seemed to be so too. Although he didn't stutter, I could hear in his voice the hints of fear. It was difficult for me to judge if the cold I felt was because of the night or the fear. Unlike last time, there was no amazing gust of wind came during our chants. Instead, we went on chanting and chanting for what seemed like almost an hour without a response. That was when we noticed the silence. When we arrived at the terrain, we could hear all the usual city night sounds: dogs, cats, cars, insects, and people in their homes. The things that you grow accustomed to so much you don't even notice anymore. But you can still notice their absence, like we were now. We couldn't even hear the wind. Despite the surprise and the ominous feeling it brought, we carried on with the summoning, repeating the chants over and over and over again. As time went on, we began to notice the temperature dropping, first slightly, then sharply, until I almost couldn't contain my teeth clattering. It was around then that I noticed from the corner of my eye a figure moving about the darkness to our left. Shocked, I looked in that direction, and N did so too. We stopped chanting and gazed upon the darkness in silence. And from the darkness, something was gazing back at us. At first, you wouldn't be able to make them out of the general ink blackness, but once your eyes adjusted a little, you would notice it. There were two spaces amidst the dark, which were darker than most, like new black ink in contrast to old, faded painting. Once my eyes noticed that, I also noticed that a silhouette of something resembling a dog, but with a different anatomy, was also outlined in the dark, again by the same effect of the two spots. My stomach dropped when I noticed what it was. It was clearly gazing at us, but we couldn't make out anything except its rough outline and what should be its two eyes. Looking at it was unlike any other experience I ever had. It wasn't simply fear like when I felt the elemental around us. It was abject terror, horror even, the feeling that I was looking at an unfathomable abyss, and that at any moment my soul could slip and fall into it to be forever lost. It was as if gazing into them transported my soul to a black and unending cold desert of abandon and fear. I had the distinct feeling that even if I screamed until my vocal cords gave up, no one would hear me. The creature kept its eyes fixated on me for a long while, until N began to address it. This time I could hear them both talking. The exchange was more or less like this: "O Glacia Labolas, great Count of Hell, we have summoned you here and given you sacrifice, and now we request a boon in exchange." The creature S voice was something halfway between a human and a dog, half primal, half elegant and composed. Despite the paradoxical nature of its sound, I still could make out the words, "Aspiring binders. How much courage must thou have to call upon my name in this night, and how much pride must grip thou hearts that you would request boons for such meager sacrifice? I feel no life in this flesh and no strength in this wine. This can pay for nothing." Me and N looked at each other anxiously. The book had specified that this ritual didn't require living beings nor blood, but something was clearly wrong. I felt as if my legs were about to give way. "What do you desire then?" N asked the creature from the darkness. We could hear a growl that seemed too much like a laugh, and the weak light from the lamppost illuminated briefly what appeared to be a full mouth of canine teeth, which shone with a red luminescence. As if the light was reflecting on something red, "I yearn for violence, end a life in my name, consecrate a corpse on the altar of brutality to me, and I shall ensure that your wish is attended." Me and N looked at each other. I saw in his face the same thing I was already thinking. Hell no. I just wanted to chant the banishment incantation right there and then, but N had warned me against it, saying that we would probably just anger the demon if we did it like that. So N told the demon we weren't going to take the deal. It was easier said than done, however, as the demon began trying to persuade us that it wasn't such a problem as we were making it out to be. He told us many things, like pointing out that we already were using a corpse to summon him, and that we could just kill another chicken or another kind of animal, no need for a human. Frankly, I felt somewhat tempted, especially when he told us that he could see a very miserable life for us if we rejected his offer, as there was no way we were fixing our grades that year without him. We hadn't even told him what we wanted yet, and the way he talked about it made me feel cold to the bone. We must have spent almost half an hour debating the merits of killing for him with the demon, until the anxiety got the best of me and I said, a bit too loud, that we weren't taking any damned deal from him. I immediately regretted what I did, for the demon's gaze focused on me again. The same horrible sensations washed over me again, just this time mixed with a sense of anger and danger emanating from him. It was a strange sensation because at the same time I also felt somewhat hypnotized, like in those movies where the prey is enchanted by the predator and remains in a stupor even while it fears and knows its imminent death. Part of me knew that I was probably done so, even if I was still in the circle. I felt my legs trembling as if trying to move. "Dante, look at it." N screamed at me and pulled me closer to him in the circle. He then began chanting the prayer for banishment in Latin, and I quickly followed him as a terrible growl began to sound all around us. Becoming louder and louder by the second, I couldn't look at the creature because of the way N held my face. But my eyes were fixed on the ground, and I could see that the light coming from the street was now flickering, alternating the terrain between light and dark. Randomly, the air around us got extremely cold, to the point that I began being able to see my breath condensed in front of my eyes. The sudden change in temperature made my fingers hurt. Then we began to hear the barking, as if all the dogs in the city had appeared in the terrain and started barking at us with murderous intent. Those barks were terrible, the kind of thing you hear in your nightmares, and just by remembering them, you feel scared. To this day, I tremble when I recall the sound. It was something from another colder and darker world, something with the primeval violence of the dogs, but with added traces of an evil no animal could ever possess. At one moment, I thought I saw the outline of a paw on the ground at the edge of my vision. I closed my eyes completely and wouldn't open them for all the money in the world. I knew that, if I did so, I would regret it heavily. After what felt like hours, the barking stopped and the temperature went back to normal. N told me I could open my eyes, and when I did, I saw that we were still at the terrain. The lights had come back, and there was no dog to be seen. I looked at him and was about to ask what had happened, but his expression made me change my mind. He had a face that wouldn't feel much out of place on a corpse. He wasn't very white, but now he was pale, almost like milk. We left the circle and dismantled the setup quickly. While doing that, I noticed that the wine and food were intact, When I pointed it out to N, he looked at it without expression and told me to leave it. Better not to touch it at all. Part of me didn't want to go home and sleep tonight, not after all I had seen. The sounds and the images of the ritual were still coming back to my head, and I was sure I would have nightmares that night. But I also didn't want to spend time in his house. It also had a strange atmosphere which I had been noticing more the more time I spent with him. It was always cold and dark, even in the sunniest days, and frankly, staying there would probably only make me think more of all that happened. So I went back home. N said he would contact me later tomorrow to talk about what happened, and we parted ways. All the way during my trip back home, and even when I got there, I couldn't shake the memories of what had happened, and the incessant feeling that something was following me. Whenever I saw or heard a dog, I felt my heart skip a heartbeat, as if the creature was going to jump from the dark and attack me at any moment. It was a very rough night. Even with the lights on and listening to podcasts, I couldn't sleep. The fear and constant feeling that there was something watching wouldn't allow it. When I finally managed to pass out, I had horrible nightmares where a large black dog with wings hunted me through the streets of a city, biting bits of my flesh and barking at me. I woke up to the sound of my cell phone ringing, bathed in sweat and trembling from the nightmares. It was N. He told me that we needed to talk and that it would be better to do in person. I agreed. We went to a cafeteria. I still hadn't eaten that day and was feeling sick, and apparently he was too, so we didn't eat anything, just drank some coffee to not get thrown out. The conversation wasn't a happy one. It was basically him saying that he was done with playing around with Goetia, especially with me. When I asked why, he said that I probably had fucked something up, probably didn't purify myself adequately, and that why the demon didn't obey us like he was meant to. I said he was full of crap, that he was leading the ritual, and if someone was to blame, it was probably him, not me. The discussion began to get worse and worse until we were almost screaming at each other, which was when the cafe's owner told us to shut up or he would throw us out of the establishment. I never felt so angry at him like then. I believe I could easily have jumped on N and punched him until his face was red. Why did he think he could talk to me like that? How could he say I was the culprit? If anyone was the culprit, it was probably him. Once outside, N, who was still looking tired from yesterday, looked at me in silence and said that if I was so good at that, maybe I would make better use of his grandpa's grimoire than him. I told him that I probably would, considering he's too much of a pussy to use it. Amazingly, N didn't react in an aggressive manner, just nodding his head and saying, "Come, I'll give it to you." Then we went back to his house. His parents, where around this time, and that must have been the third time I had ever seen the two of them together. They never talked much to me. Or N, though. He had told me that they were very absent as usual. The house was cold and dark, but his room was very different. He had opened all the windows and allowed the sunlight in, changing the entire atmosphere. He quickly opened the chest and took the grimoire out of it, the one where we had found the ritual to summon the demon. "Here, take it. Choke on it for all I care. Maybe then you will learn to listen to me," he told me while holding it up to my face. The tone of his voice was still bitter. I got a bad feeling then. A small flash of sobriety in the storm of anger that had suddenly washed over us. I was fighting with what was probably the only friend I had in college. And over what? A old, dusty book that could fuck me up. But this doubt quickly vanished as he shoved it at my face again, repeating for me to take it. I felt I could punch him right then and there, and so took it from his hands and walked away in silence. I didn't even say goodbye. With the book on my possession, I began to study the rituals alone. I was sure that I had done everything correctly, and that the issue was Ennis' obsession with purity and theory instead of focusing on practice. The months that followed were very rough as I became more and more obsessed with the book and its rituals, to the point I began skipping almost half of the college days to dedicate myself to studying the rituals I had given up completely on the idea of studying for college. and decided that the best plan would be to make a deal with another demon for knowledge. I believe that if instead of material gains such as wealth I asked for knowledge, I would be able to evade the usual end people have of losing everything one day. But I didn't have the courage to summon Labolas again. I still had nightmares about the whole ordeal, so I decided to try my luck with another demon. Luckily, there are many demons who grant knowledge. One of them is Buer, a president of hell in their hierarchy. It would be more difficult to do the ritual without NS knowledge. He had a veritable trove of occult materials and had been doing this for a while, whereas I was a complete soul initiate. But I was certain I would be able to manage, and then I could shove it on NS' face. I decided that this time I would leave nothing to chance. So I borrowed some money from my parents without them knowing, and bought everything I would need, including a live chicken for sacrifice. The most difficult part was the chicken. I had to hide it through an entire afternoon so my parents wouldn't ask about it. For that, I asked the guy who sold it to me to tie it up neatly so that it couldn't scream or move around. I put it on a big box and hid it on my room. I was so obsessed with doing it back then that it didn't bother me in the slightest to do that with the poor animal, even though in the past I had never been insensible to the suffering of animals. That night I went to a crossroads in my neighborhood. Unlike the other nights, the air was mild, not cold, and the wind blew softly. In general, a much more pleasant atmosphere. This didn't help my anxiety, however. It was the third time I tried a summoning, but it would be the first time I would do it alone, and involving live sacrifice. I was scared not only of what could go wrong, but of some hobo fucking me up, or, God forbid, the police passing through and me getting into trouble. It took a lot more time to set up the circles and ritual apparel without N, but I was so obsessed with the work that I didn't stop once, not even when the chicken moved inside the bag I had brought it in. When all was done, I began the ritual. Again, I'm not going to explain how it was, but suffice to say that it involved killing the chicken and draining its blood. Just remembering that I did without thinking twice makes me sick. The poor animal was clearly terrified and shaking around trying to free itself, while I did my thing without an ounce of compassion. Once it all was done and the sacrifice was ready, I began chanting for Buer. I chanted over and over, my voice growing louder with each repetition as the initial shyness and fear was replaced with an ardent desire to see the creature and be granted my wish. I don't know how many times I repeated it, but at one moment I began to hear dogs howling and cats mewing where before there was a sepulchral silence. This immediately scared me, as I thought Labolas was somehow being summoned, so I stopped the chant immediately and looked around. But the air wasn't cold like I remembered, and I didn't see the black dots like I had seen last time. Instead, my nostrils were assaulted by a wet smell, somewhat like what you feel when you go to the forest after a long rain. It was the odor of nature, savage and undisturbed wild. Then I began to hear some shuffling towards the abandoned terrain to my right. I turned my eyes there and saw something that almost killed me. I had seen the representations of Buer in the book before and found them quite silly, but it's completely different when you see something in person. The demon S form was something grotesque. I could make out the rough outline of a lioness head from the light that shone on the terrain. The creature, however, was still somewhat hidden in darkness, so it was difficult to be certain of its form. But I could make up goat legs around it, like the rays of the sun in old paintings, the lower hooves clapping about on the ground like some mockery of satyrs, and the upper ones dancing wildly on a savage and orgiastic primeval dance. The eyes of the creature, unlike those of Labolas, weren't dark. They shone like you normally see with cats in the dark, making it seem like two stars inhabited the lion head that now gazed upon me. The creature's appearance scared me, but it didn't feel like the same kind of fear that Labolas gave me. Back then, it was the fear that it would harm me out of evil, but here it was more like the feeling you have when you look at a wild animal and knows it could kill you out of instinct. The creature then spoke to me. It had a guttural voice, kind of like a lion's roar, and asked me what I wanted with him. I explained to him that I wanted the knowledge to get through my tests at college. And he gazed in silence at me for a while. I could swear I also heard him sniffing the air. At no moment he left the terrain or the darkness, although every now and then a part of his body would enter the light and I would be able to see him better. It was a very tense situation, like when you are a kid and are face to face with a street dog. The two of you are quiet, and you know that if you make the smallest movement, he might attack you. But you also think that if you stay put, he will jump you at any moment. After what felt like an eternity, the creature answered with a growl that he would grant me my wish, and then he walked back into the dark, melding into the cold black nothing until I couldn't make out his silhouette any longer. When it was all over, the air went back to normal, and the peaceful silence returned to the world. I was trembling slightly and felt extremely tired after the experience. My head was pounding slightly, and I just wanted to go home. But I felt like I had accomplished something that night. There was pride in me, for I had achieved what N had not. I had managed a deal with a demon. Of course, I was somewhat scared that it would backfire like it does so many times, but for the moment the pride and exhaustion took over most of my brain, so I just went back home and slept for the night. Amazingly, it was one of the best nights of sleep I ever had since the ritual with N, and probably in my entire life. I don't remember any dreams and woke up completely rested and full of energy. Later that week I had a test in college and I managed to get a grade high enough to compensate for my previous lacking in past months. The same thing happened to all the other end of semester tests. It appeared as if everything was going well. I entered my summer break feeling on top of life. I even contacted N to shove on his face how I managed to succeed where he had failed. N, however, didn't seem interested in talking to me. After picking up my first call, he simply blocked my number. During this period, I began to dedicate myself more and more to the study of the grimoire and using its rituals. I had many experiences with the supernatural during those times. I saw ghosts, other demons, had dreams which were prophetic, and received many revelations of secrets both profane and holy. Some of these happenings were still scary. During this period, I started having sleep paralysis episodes, something that I never had before, and started seeing shadows in my house during the night. But nothing ever harmed me or my family, so I believed it was only a side effect of being more spiritually oriented. Now I think the most noteworthy event during this period was when I contacted a demon called Vine, for I had read that he was capable of imparting knowledge of the true nature of social hierarchies, something I believed could help me a lot in life. The summoning was successful, and out of all the demons I saw, he was one of the most normal and even agreeable. I remember he had a distinct accent that seemed British, even when talking Portuguese. He told me much about the social classes, about how all riches are born out of sacrifice and how that heritage remains with them forever, how one must be ready to assume such a stigma to grow, and how greatness always requires tribute. I believed that I had managed to cheat reality somehow, but as I was about to find out, everything has a price. When college returned and I had another test, I noticed that I didn't even have the wisdom of Bauer anymore, and so got completely fucked in the exam. This bummed me, but after thinking for a while, I came to the conclusion that my ritual didn't ensure knowledge for the whole life. The sacrifice was too small. Thus, it followed that I would have to sacrifice something for him again. However, when I summoned the demon, he told me that he desired more than a simple chicken, that his hunger must be satiated if I desired the knowledge. Because of his demands, my sacrifices grew greater and greater, going from simple chickens to stray animals. That was probably the lowest point of my life, when I did things that I look back and think that if I met my former self nowadays, I would probably beat the shit out of me without an ounce of remorse. But it bore fruits, and time and again I managed to get the needed grades to advance in college, despite not studying at all. As time went on, my situation began to deteriorate. Almost every night was tormented by nightmares, sounds in my room, shadows at the corner of my eyes, and sometimes the sounds of hooves on the roof of my house. This began to have an effect in my health. I began to get sick far more easily, and the lack of sleep made me highly irritable and unable to focus. It came to the point that all I could really do was study the rituals in the grimoire and browse the web, for I had no interest in anything else. It was about that time that N came to me again. We had stopped talking, but we still frequented the same college. He was now 1 semester behind me thanks to having failed his tests. But we still saw each other every now and then, although we never spoke, and made an active effort to ignore the other. He came to me one day when I was eating. The difference between us by then was notable. While I seemed more like a skeleton with perpetual dark circles on my eyes and my face always gazing down, he seemed to have recovered from his perpetually tired expression from back then. His slumped eye had almost gone back to normal, and his posture while walking seemed fixed. In general, he seemed way healthier than when we met. I expected him to pick up a fight, but to my surprise, he spoke to me gently and without anger, something that confused me. After all, we had never made peace after what happened. We talked a long while, after he managed to break the ice and reach me beyond the layer of fossilized anger and bitterness. I noticed that I had felt terribly lonely all those years and really missed him. I had no friends to talk to after losing him. We talked about our lives, and I quickly noticed that while mine was easy, but without much to be proud of except the occultic practices, his was a lot harder, but full of interesting events. He told me how he had to repeat most subjects in his first semester and almost lost his scholarship, but managed to pull through after much study, how he picked up writing as a hobby and dedicated himself more to his course, to the point that he never had problems with grades again. He shared many stories about the places where he was an intern the past years, the people he met, the problems he got into, and how he solved them. In general, it seemed like a month of his life had more things than my past years. When I told him about my life, he seemed genuinely concerned for me, saying that I should stop messing with the grimoire, that it was clearly fucking me up, and that I couldn't go on like that forever. We argued because of that, for while it was undeniable that my life had many problems ever since I began the rituals, I also had gained much and grew accustomed to it. The truth is that, while I feared the demons and for my eternity, I feared being left with no magical solutions anymore for my problems and losing the power and knowledge I had gained until then. I had the distinct feeling that, should I stop doing the rituals, especially those for knowledge, I wouldn't be able to finish college at all. Part of me also felt resentment for the fact that N would come out on top if I turned my back on the rituals. I would basically be proving him right and saying that all my years doing rituals had been a waste. Because of this, our discussion didn't get anywhere. We parted ways when the time for class came, and I was hoping to never see him again. But when I arrived home later that day, I saw a message from him on my cell phone. He had unblocked me and wanted to resume contact. This coincided with a period when the demon-s demands for tribute had grown too large, to the point that they began asking me for human blood, something that I wasn't willing to give. It felt as if I was at the event horizon of my humanity, and something in me still held me back from diving headfirst into the abyss. But I couldn't shake away the obsession I had with the occult. I had entangled myself too much into it, to the point that it was easier for me to contemplate death than a life without the occult. And contemplate death I did. I began to have suicidal thoughts almost daily. Depression hit me like a truck around this period, to the point where I couldn't even bring myself to study the occult. Then one night, I had what was probably the worst nightmare of my entire life. It was a grotesque dream where I was dragged by animal-headed people to what seemed like the altar of a temple. There was an enormous crowd of similar creatures looking at me from below, and I felt that they all were hungry for my flesh. The whole scenario was illuminated by torches held by demonic statues, for the night was dark, and there was no star or moon in the sky. I was suspended on a pole by the creatures, and they began whipping me with iron-tipped flails, tearing the skin from my body. That was the worst pain I had ever felt in my life. Even tough it was a dream, I felt as if I could die in that exact moment. The blood flowed from the open wounds down the pole and the altar into the steps of the temple, and the crowd of demons bellow-howled with laughter and ecstasy. This went on for hours, a torture that never seemed to end. I couldn't even summon forces to beg them to stop, and it came to the point that, despite my irreligiosity, I wanted to cry to God for help, but I couldn't even do that. Then they dragged me from the pole to what looked like an altar of pure white marble and laid me there. The pain I felt because of the open wounds touching the marble was horrible, but it was nothing compared with what I saw then. A dog-headed man with wings was approaching, his face contorted in an inhumane smile of hunger, his eyes two pools of blackness. I knew what he was, and in that moment despair like I never felt gripped my heart. When he reached me, he sunk his teeth into my chest without ceremony, tearing at my flesh like a rabid animal, blood and flesh flying all around in a grotesque spectacle. The pain was something beyond anything Ivy felt, beyond something I could even describe. Just trying to remember it is already enough to make me tremble and feel nausea. I screamed like I never had and probably never will again, screamed until I passed out and woke up, screaming and trembling in my room. My parents came to see what was happening, and I told them I just had a nightmare. They screamed at me for making such a noise during a weekday and went back to bed, but I couldn't go back to sleep. I was still trembling. Cold sweat ran down my skin and I felt a horrible pain in my back. I looked at my back in the mirror and saw 4 horrible bruises in it. Like something had scratched it terribly. I felt in that moment I could faint again. I sat on my bed with all the lights in the room turned on and decided I would not sleep again that night, and that this was too much for me. I called N the next day, told him I wanted to talk, and we arranged to meet again on the same cafeteria we had last met so many years ago. I told him everything, how the demons were demanding more and more of me, how my health was declining and the terrible nightmare and the bruises. He didn't seem impressed by what I told him, saying that he guessed something of the sort was happening to me. He told me that since I probably didn't do the purification procedures correctly, the ritualist protections didn't work out correctly, and thus I got tainted by the demons who never truly went away when I finished them, instead remaining near me and feeding off my energies. I asked him if he could help me get rid of this, and he said that he didn't have such a power, that although he still had his Grandfather S books, I spent so much time with the demons that a complex ceremony beyond his abilities would be needed. He said that only some religious authority could do it. He told me of a priest who, apparently, was a friend of his grandfather when he was still alive, and who shared his interest for the more occult aspects of religion. I had doubts if this would work, mainly because I was not religious, but he explained to me that it was the best way, since the demons of the Goetia most commonly work in an Abrahamic environment. The Abrahamic priesthood is more capable of dealing with them, and that the belief of the healer is the most important part of the ritual. Besides, I already believed the rituals of the priests had power, for I had been using their books. I agreed to do it, and we went to the church of the priest that very day. It was a small building built in a classical style on an unassuming neighborhood, a place you could easily forget. Once there, we spoke to the priest. His name was JJ, apparently was already on friendly terms with N, and when he began telling the priest about my situation, he didn't seem surprised, saying that he recognized the great spiritual pain upon my back. The moment he laid his eyes upon me, he said that the ritual would be best done as quickly as possible, but that he needed time to prepare. He told me that, while he prepared, the best I could do was try to keep my body strong and not involve myself with anything supernatural, especially not the grimoire. That last week before the purification ceremony was one of the worst times of my life. I had constant nightmares, and there wasn't a single night I slept well. I got sick with something and had to deal with my head pounding and a high fever too. During the nights, I heard dogs barking outside and things on the roof of my house like never before. Amazingly, this cacophony of hellish sounds only affected me. For my parents, it seemed like another normal day in life. When N and I went to the church again for the purification ceremony, I was barely able to walk straight, needing him to prop me up to meet the priest. I took the grimoire with me too, as they had said it was necessary. I will not divulge the details of the ceremony as the priest asked me not to, but suffice it to say it was a long night when lots of things left my body and lots of doors were closed. I woke up the next day after a dreamless night, and no longer did I feel any spiritual or material malaise. After that, I never saw the grimoire again. The priest said that this kind of thing is supposed to be used by laymen whose weak wills can easily be warped by demons, and that he would now take care of it. I didn't complain. After all, that I wanted nothing more to do with the grimoire. N was happy that I finally snapped out of it, saying that he regretted having given it to me. He told me that, after our experience, he got rid of the other demonology works his grandfather had given him by handing them over to the priest, too, just keeping the theoretical works in his home. Right after doing that, he felt his life get immensely better, and it was the beginning of the good times he had told me about. A similar phenomena came over me after the purification calm returned to my nights. My health improved, and my mood stabilized. When I looked back upon what happened, I noticed just how far I had strayed, and how close I came to total destruction. There were heavy costs. I couldn't finish college because, thanks to not having studied at all for the past years, I had no idea about the most basic points of the course, so I had to leave it and go work at a menial job in construction. It was rough, but after some years working, I joined a trade school and started a course on electrical engineering. After some more years, I managed to get a certificate and now work as an autonomous electrical mechanic. My friendship with N continued and grew stronger after this. After all those years, I finally made good on my promise back then and studied the theory he had been pestering me long ago to study about. And although I wasn't planning on summoning anything anymore, it had wisdoms for life that I took to heart. Not only that, the whole ordeal heavily influenced my worldview. All of this taught me that there are forces out there you are not supposed to mess with, games whose rules are to be followed strictly. Even the words of some demons, like the wisdom imparted on me by Vine, still had some ring of truth to them, despite being warped by their demonic inclinations. But the greatest experience I brought out of this was probably that no matter how low you have fallen, you can always climb back up. Stay safe, Anons. Don't let an obsession ruin your life. You are better than that.